Still no invasion. Israel's been saying for days it's ready for a full ground offensive in Gaza. But outside of limited incursions, the infantry still on standby. According to U.S. media, the United States, through its defense secretary, urging his Israeli counterpart to hold off, this in a bid to secure the release of more hostages, like the pair of Americans freed after negotiations brokered by Qatar. With the number of abducted that Israel now puts at 222, we'll ask how that bargaining is going and how the leadership in Israel is handling the crisis, what with a prime minister who's rowed with his own military and whose popularity has plummeted spectacularly. Benjamin Netanyahu still refusing to accept blame for the security lapses that allowed Hamas to carry out the October 7th massacre. But even his opponents say that at the middle of a war is not the right time to replace a leader. Are they correct? More broadly, the blockade and daily bombing of Gaza continues to kill civilians, Palestinian civilians. A few dozen aid trucks from Egypt won't be enough as the EU considers whether to endorse the United Nations call for a humanitarian truce, as each day of war heightens the threat of a second front with the Iran-aligned Hezbollah movement out of Lebanon. It's clear that time is on nobody's side. Today in the France 24 debate, we're asking, when is the ground offensive? Joining us from Tel Aviv, former Israeli intelligence official Avi Medel, geopolitical analyst and author of Inside the Middle East. Thank you for joining us.
Hello, good evening. Thank you for having me.
From Ramallah, Mustafa Bardi, Secretary General of the Palestine National Initiative, member of the PLO's Central Committee. Welcome back to the show.
Thank you. Good to be with you.
John Linden is Executive Director of the Alliance for Middle East Peace. Good to see you.
You too. Thank you.
And we'll be joined from Jerusalem by correspondent Iris Mockler shortly. Your reactions on the hashtag F24debate. A third convoy in as many days reaching Gaza from Egypt. 20 trucks, some 50 in all in 3 days. That's half the daily needs of that Palestinian territory, says the UN. Meanwhile, the Israeli airstrikes continue. So do the Hamas and Islamic Jihad rocket and drone attacks from Gaza. No ground invasion on day 17, but there have been small incursions into Gaza by Israeli forces.
In Gaza, IDF forces raided Gaza today, close to the border, as part of the effort to prepare the space for an attack following information on the missing and abducted, a top priority of national mission. During one of the raids, an IDF fighter was killed and 3 fighters were wounded. Their families were notified.
Avi Medel, first of all, what are these limited incursions about?
We have a couple of objectives. One is to clear out the whole area close to the Israeli communities. We have to remember that as until now, there has been remains of those terrorists that are trying to escape after they have infiltrated to Israel. The other thing is to try and to find some other tracks and maybe some remains of bodies or hostages that were killed and were left on the field. And then there are other, I would say, intelligence gathering capacities and objectives that are assigned to those small incursions teams that are operating in different parts of the Gaza Strip.
Are you surprised that 17 days in, there hasn't been a ground invasion?
No, I'm not surprised. We have to understand the full scale of this whole thing. We are looking at some 350,000 Israeli reservists. We are looking at about, massive arms of tanks, infantry, cannons, and many other things. We are looking at a huge logistical effort, in addition to the whole need to basically coordinate the military plans, basically coordinating intelligence, operation, logistics, and so forth and so forth. We also have to remember that it's not something that you move such a massive war machine at once. It takes time to generate that. It takes time to position that machine. It takes time to position it in the right position. And it's not less about also the right timing to conduct such a wide-scale move as it's expected to be.
What do you mean by the timing?
What I'm meaning is that, Hamas did its first move. Now it's Israel's turn. And in a way, I would say that Israel doesn't necessarily have to stand up with a watch and counting the minutes or counting the seconds. Israel has to come to the point where Israel would say, this is the ultimate point from all perspectives, meaning military preparedness, political situation, diplomatic conditions, terms of legitimacy, preparedness in the Israeli home front and other issues, that Israel would say this is the conjunction, the right moment for us in the best ideal conditions to start, to launch this ground operation. Basically what I'm saying, this is not something that is subdued to some sort of like watching the minutes or the seconds. And there is something else we have to remember in that context. Outrooting Hamas and Islamic Jihad, two major terror entities in Gaza Strip, is not something that is going to happen overnight. This is a long-term, multi-phase process that has to run its course. We are looking at something that is a long-term, multi-phase process.
The defense minister talking about at least 3 months. According to the New York Times, the U.S. has 2 reasons to be strongly suggesting delaying that ground invasion. The first is that because the Pentagon is helping advise Israel on military actions, including the ground invasion. The second reason, the defense secretary talking about recovering the hostages as a priority. That's according to one U.S. official quoted there by the New York Times. The Associated Press also in the last hours quoting sources on that. Let's cross now to Jerusalem and correspondent Iris Makler. Iris, if Israel waits, first of all, on the military side of things, if Israel waits on the U.S.'s timing, that could be a long time. As you know, in a war, the U.S. doesn't travel lightly. They wait until they've got all the sandbags and all of the aircraft carriers and all of the soldiers.
Well, there has been a suggestion in the press today, coming out of Washington and Jerusalem, that there's been a direct request to Israel to delay this so that America can get its more men to this region. It has the 2 aircraft carriers, as you know. They brought in 2,000 troops last week, I believe. And now we're seeing a request for more troops, which will bring the troop numbers here, that's US troop numbers here in the Middle East, to the highest level since 2014, since the battle for ISIS began. So there is that element too. You know, Israel isn't going this entirely alone. It's relying on the US for Iron Dome intercept missile funding for the north of the country. It's asked for billions of dollars for that in case there is a 2-front war. So I think it does have to consider the US timetable, but it's becoming plain, I would say, that there will be a ground invasion and it won't be weeks. You know, we are talking days. That's how I read what's being reported here at the moment.
And if the U.S. is asking Israel to pull on the handbrake for now, let's cut to the chase here. Is it about military preparedness or is it about the hostage, of which there could be an estimated 13 U.S. nationals still there?
That's a good question. It's quite interesting. I've seen the parents of the hostages saying that there isn't enough priority given to the hostage situation and that the first priority should be getting the hostages out, particularly the women and children, you know, some 30 children in that new figure of 222. It's believed 3 are there without their parents, including a 9-month-old baby. Get them out and then do whatever military job you have to do. But the parents are complaining that that is not necessarily the government's priority. We did hear from the IDF spokesperson today. He said that that was a national priority and a first national priority. But the parents and relatives, brothers, sisters, fathers, sons of people who are held hostage in Gaza or simply disappeared and presumed to be held hostage in Gaza, they don't feel that the return of the hostages is a national priority.
Mustafa Bardi, I guess 2 essential points here to unpack. First off, as you heard, that ground invasion in all likelihood is indeed coming. And the second, your reaction when you hear our correspondent describing the U.S. building up to its highest number of troops in the region since 2014.
I don't know why the United States would be participating not only in being complicit with war crimes, but also in participating in them. At this very moment, 3 war crimes are happening to Palestinians by the Israelis. One is genocide through these terrible airstrikes that has taken the lives of 5,087 Palestinians, including 2,055 children. These are also human beings, these children, and the people who were killed. Add to that the act of collective punishment, depriving the civilian population of Gaza from water, electricity, medicines. They're sent 54 trucks, that's 1/10 of the daily supply to Gaza usually. It's 500 trucks daily, not 100. And what Gaza did not get so far during this whole situation is more than 8,000 trucks. So 54 trucks mean nothing, especially that yesterday the Israelis deprived or prevented the supply of oxygen to hospitals. We're talking about 120 children who could die in incubators because they don't have electricity, they don't have oxygen. Add to that 16,000 Palestinian injured people now in Gaza with all these airstrikes that continue nonstop. And many of them cannot get proper treatment. I was shocked yesterday and shattered when I learned that some doctors had to operate on patients without anesthesia because they don't have any. And this terrible humanitarian situation is unacceptable. The fact that 2,055 children are killed, 1,119 women are killed, and people talk about a military operation as if these Palestinians are nothing, are not human beings, As the Israeli defense minister said, the Palestinians are human animals, justifying all these crimes that are committed against them. Of course, the ground operation has been suspended mainly because 50 civilians will be released today, and the Red Cross is about to receive them because Hamas agreed to release them all without in exchange for nothing, because it was wrong in the first place to have any of these civilians as hostages. And they are going to be released, and that's why this ground operation is sort of delayed or suspended. And I think it's very good that these civilians are going to be released, but I don't think the Israeli establishment, as was said, that Netanyahu or the Israeli establishment cares about the rest of the prisoners. As a matter of fact, the airstrikes of Israel have already killed 22 of the Israeli prisoners. And they don't care. Netanyahu doesn't care. All Netanyahu thinks about is how to save himself. He knows that what has happened and the Israeli failure on the 7th of October will cost him his position. He's trying to stay there at any cost. Any inquiry that will be initiated will immediately say that he should leave his post, which means he has to face 4 cases of corruption, which means he will go to jail. And he's going to kill anybody to keep his position. I think what shocks me a lot is this. I care for any Israeli or Palestinian that is killed. I don't want any Palestinian or Israeli to be killed. But this insensitivity to the fact that Palestinians are bombarded around the clock with airstrikes, having nothing to defend themselves with, and the killing of all these civilians is totally unacceptable. And by the way, not only in the West Bank, not only in Gaza, but also in the West Bank, we've lost, since the beginning of these incidents, 95 people, some of whom were killed by Israeli illegal settlers under the protection of the Israeli army.
All right, let's unpack that, because there's a lot in what you say. And John Linden, listening to Mustafa Barghouti, there's the sense that it comes back to the question we asked at the outset about Avi Medel. Why hasn't it happened yet? Time is not on either side in this war. But when you see now, is it tenable to be headed now towards 3 months of war? How will the optics of that play out?
They'll be devastating, and it goes far beyond optics. The toll on civilian life will be unlike anything that we've seen before in the history of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and that's a high bar, and we've already cleared it, I think, in the events of a little over 2 weeks. I think the devastation you're seeing in Gaza day to day is extraordinary. I'm speaking to colleagues there and their friends and family who have lived through many wars. There's never been an intensity of bombing like we've seen right now. And then equally, when it was alluded to in Mustafa's comments as well and yours, the situation in the West Bank is very close to boiling point, and in East Jerusalem, very undercover. But the situation in East Jerusalem, speaking to a colleague today, is almost from a humanitarian perspective as well, actually. Like over 70% of East Jerusalemites live below the poverty line, and there's people are afraid to go to work, the service is not being provided. And then we zoom out, there's a situation in the north, which I think is one of the big calculations for the delay of the ground operation, because we have the West Bank, the south, and the north of the Lebanon border, all at the precipice or immersed in very significant escalatory violence. I suspect what is going on is the United States is urging, and there's leaks saying this, a delay to a ground operation until there's some sort of contingencies addressed for all of those. But in the meantime, the humanitarian situation in Gaza continues to grow worse. We've had warnings today about the possibility of waterborne diseases. So I think geopolitically, like we've just spoken about, obviously there's going to be a meeting in the Security Council, there's a big debate in the European Union. Whilst all these important people internationally are deciding what's going to happen, please provide the humanitarian aid for the people in Gaza who are currently living in the greatest crisis in the history of the Gaza Strip. There seems to be no reason for that not to be the overriding priority in this kind of waiting period we grisly seem to be in right now.
Avi Medel, can Israel, militarily, they can do it, but can they politically afford to spend 3 months in the Gaza Strip?
You know, I heard Mr. Barghoudi's speech and rhetoric. You know, many players in the Middle East are longing for the downfall of Hamas and Islamic Jihad. These are two radical, extreme factors. Mr. Barghouti forgot to mention, unfortunately, that in 2007, Hamas took over Gaza Strip violently, butchered his own brothers, the Palestinian Authority, throwing people from the rooftops and shooting them in the hospitals. And since then, Hamas dragged Gaza Strip to havoc, to disaster, to death. Many people in the Arab world loathe Hamas. Many people are wishing Hamas will fall down.
And that's why you are killing Palestinian civilians? That's why you are killing Palestinian civilians now?
In the Palestinian Authority backroom, they are just waiting impatiently to see their bitter enemy, Hamas, falling down. So this is so far as for Mr. Barghouti's speech. Here is another thing that we have to take into consideration. You know, it's the same scenario time and time again. Hamas, ISIS, and Islamic Jihad are brutal murderers. Since 2007, they have been terrorizing millions of Israelis. They have been terrorizing their own people in Gaza Strip. They are using their own people in Gaza Strip as a human shield. They are attacking indiscriminately Israeli populations with rockets and missiles and militants who are coming to Israel and now butchering babies while they are raping their mothers. So, you know, we have to come to the point and say, enough is enough. You can't provide shelter anymore to Hamas, ISIS, or to Islamic Jihad with the same old story of humanitarian crisis. And here is something else to say about Gaza Strip. Many people in Gaza Strip benefit Hamas rule because Hamas governs Gaza Strip. Hamas employs 50,000 officials who make money out of Hamas government. Hamas basically levy taxes. Hamas enjoy all kinds of income of monies, billions of dollars that have been poured into Gaza Strip.
But it is a fact, Avi Medel, that's...
I'm not done yet.
It is a fact that the civilian...
It is about time for the world to wake up. After October 7th, we saw the fruit.
It's about time to end occupation.
Hamas ISIS organization.
Avi Medel.
Hamas ISIS organization is a brutal, murderous organization.
All right, Avi Medel. It is a fact at the same time. It is a fact at the same time that it is a fact at the same time that Palestinian civilians are dying and they're dying in huge numbers. It is also a fact. That advocacy groups have pointed this out, that Palestinians on the quiet are being chased from their homes in the West Bank. Is Israel doing all it can to get the international community behind it on its side?
Israel is doing an enormous effort to save Palestinian life in Gaza Strip, while Hamas is doing an enormous effort to sacrifice his own brothers in the Gaza Strip. We saw the picture of Hamas trying to prevent Gaza people from moving to one place to a safe haven. What does it take, for God's sake, for the world to wake up? Hamas, ISIS is a brutal, murderous, cynical organization. The evidence is in front of us. Many people in Gaza Strip are suffering from Hamas rule. He is terrorizing them. He's butchering them. He's using them as a human shield. Across the Arab world, there is a lot of anger and criticism of Hamas because of his coward behavior. It's about time that the international community will say to Hamas, enough is enough. You are ISIS-style organization. You are a murderous organization. You are every time playing the card of, oh, we are so miserable. We are so victims. While you, Hamas, you and the Arab world is saying that to Hamas, you are the one that's responsible for the catastrophe in Gaza Strip. You are the one that dragged Gaza Strip to havoc and destruction and death. It's about time Hamas will be held accountable for his atrocities.
Mustafa Bardi, very quickly, because I want to move on to what the other point you made about domestic politics in Israel.
Well, your guest has repeated so many lies that were told by the Israelis, but repeating lies do not make them facts. Hamas is not ISIS. The only man I know in the region who cooperated with ISIS was Benjamin Netanyahu, who brought ISIS fighters from Syria through the Golan Heights to treat them in Israeli hospitals. And that's something shameful he should be ashamed of. Hamas is not ISIS, and I'm not going to defend Hamas here. I don't belong to Hamas, but I am telling you, this dehumanization of Hamas is used to dehumanize all Palestinians. And the root problem here, what would you tell a person like Ramiz Souri, who's a Christian Palestinian who was bombarded in the oldest third church in the world in Gaza, and lost 12 of his family members, including his 3 children? What does he have to do with Hamas? This is a slaughter. This is a genocide against all the Palestinian population. And this is the 6th war that Israel is conducting on Hamas. And it will not eradicate it because Hamas is an idea before it is an organization. The question here is why Israel continues the Israeli military occupation of Palestinian land. 56 years, yes, enough is enough. 56 years of oppression, 56 years of apartheid, 75 years of displacement. That is what we should say enough is enough about.
John Linden, so
Hamas did not exist 40 years ago or 35 years ago. You used to accuse PLO of being a terrorist organization. The question is why Israel continues to occupy Palestinian land? Why Israel obstructed since 2014 any peace talks? And why Israel is not allowing the establishment of an independent Palestinian state.
Let's address some of these points. John Linden, there's the initial horror on October the 7th. And by the way, Hamas using body cams to carry out some of those massacres. Yes. And we're getting more and more evidence of that. And then on the other hand, what you described going on right now inside of Gaza.
Yeah, I mean, so ALMEP, the organization that I run, we're 160 plus organizations of Israelis and Palestinians. I'm unusual in that every day I'm hearing the trauma from both directions. Palestinian colleagues sharing stories, images, videos of what's happening in Gaza. Israeli colleagues of what happened on October 7th, including 2 members of our organization who have leaders who are currently held hostage inside Gaza. And I agree, I want to underline the call for the hostages to be released. I think that's one of the ways in which we can actually change the current dynamic that we're on. But I want to kind of zoom out and address some of the points made, because I can hear in both comments from the region a sense that this is a watershed moment and that things need to change. Now, there's a very different understanding, perhaps, within both Israel and Palestine what may need to happen. But I think we all need to acknowledge that we've had a glimpse into an abyss here of how bad things can get, and I think they're going to get worse over the coming days. And it needs to be seen as a place for a handbrake turn back towards diplomacy. When we talk with the international community, by the way, this is the most attention they've been paying to Israel-Palestine for 20 years. Let's ask why. Because of horrific violence. Because they have deprioritized this conflict for the last 2 decades, failed Israelis and Palestinians, and allowed a situation of unprecedented escalation to take place. So maybe the only thing that may, in hindsight, at some time in the future, be a positive outcome of this horror show we're seeing right now is people like Emmanuel Macron coming to the region, President Biden, saying that this is our top priority, not just to try and make sure that the conflict itself is waged according to international humanitarian law and that humanitarian aid is provided. These are very important. No, that in its aftermath, we have a sincere, determined and conclusive, not just effort, project that succeeds to deliver peace, equality, self-determination and security to both Israelis and Palestinians. If the world moves on after this horror show and moves back to this failed paradigm of conflict management, then there's an awful lot of responsibility in Brussels, Berlin and Washington, D.C., as well as in the region itself.
And we'll get back to what could happen with Emmanuel Macron's visit and an EU summit that will follow on Thursday. I want to talk about domestic politics in Israel for a moment. We've mentioned those hostages at several times. The first two liberated thanks to Qatar, raising hope more will come. Chicago area residents Judith Tai Ranan and her teenage daughter Natalie Shoshana Ranan had been on a trip to the Nahal Oz kibbutz when they were captured October 7th. It's the man in the middle, though, grabbing headlines. Many Israelis, including Haaretz cartoonist Amos Biderman, unhappy to see Benjamin Netanyahu's appointed coordinator for the captives and the missing. His name is Gal Hirsch in that frame, the retired general who is under investigation for corruption, accused of getting the job because of loyalties to Netanyahu, not his hidden skills as a negotiator. And by the way, if the cartoon's not enough, here's the lead editorial next to it, Iris Makler, with the words, instead of freeing the hostages, Hirsch, like everyone in Netanyahu's circle, is preoccupied with absolving the prime minister of responsibility. So even the hostage release becomes a moment of internal political strife?
I think Netanyahu is his whole government is in internal political strife right now. He is sold himself as Mr. Security. That was his name in Hebrew. And then on his watch, there has been the largest security failure, both in terms of intelligence, but also in terms of protection. You know, the Israel Defense Forces, that's what they're called. The IDF didn't come in time to help people. All of those things cause internal strife for him. The criticism that is made is that he can't put all his own personal problems, all of what might come after, to one side and actually manage this conflict or manage this issue, either militarily or diplomatically, as is being suggested, you know, a watershed moment, do something with it. He can't do any of that because he's just obsessed with his own interests. That's what I read. That's all the criticisms that I read. So there's no faith in him, really. There's a very fractured cabinet. The army is briefing against him because he's been briefing against them. Just today, we saw an announcement from the Prime Minister's office saying that reports of friction between the army and the cabinet are misplaced. Don't report them anymore, they're not factual. Well, you only put those things out when they are factual, really, frankly. And all of this is bad for the feeling of, here's what the people say. The people here say anything that's getting done at the moment is getting done because people, ordinary people, form a group, go get it done, help people move out of their houses, find them goods. All of that's being done by ordinary people. The government is nowhere to be seen. And that's why I think the latest opinion poll showed an 80% disapproval rating for Benjamin Netanyahu.
Avi Medel, before the show, I looked up, during World War I, France replaced 5 prime ministers. So you can change leaders in wartime. Should Benjamin Netanyahu go now?
Well, as mentioned before, there is a growing debate within Israeli society. There is a lot of criticism on Netanyahu. He's totally, disliked today in Israel, and for good reason. He refuses to take responsibility for this big failure that happens during his watch, during his shift. And it's definitely percolate to all level of the public realm and public discussion. Roughly speaking, there are 2 opposing perspectives regarding that issue. One camp says, right now we are at a war. We are in a brutal war. We have to defend ourselves. This is a war over the fate of Israel and the people of Israel. So for now, let us all focus in the war, winning the war. And then after that, we will turn and to deal with political issues. And then there is the opposing camp that says, like, no. The fact that we are engaged in a war doesn't necessarily mean that we also have to neglect the political arena. We have to demand accountability of the leaders of the state of Israel, the current government that is coming across under massive criticism, and rightly so. This government is dysfunctional. And actually, as mentioned before, what we see today is just a disgrace where the government is unable to provide its mission, its responsibility for people. Luckily, the people of Israel are so resourceful, they can basically manage themselves. But this government in Israel is basically a disgrace, and this is a dysfunctional government.
And
these are the two basic camps that you see today in Israel engage in this heating debate regarding that issue.
And do you agree with Mustafa Bardi when he makes the point that if you're Benjamin Netanyahu and you know that the day the war is over, you're in front of an inquiry panel, that he's got every interest in prolonging the war?
Mustafa Barghouti has a very short memory. Let me refresh his memory. On October 7th, Hamas, ISIS, launched attack on Israeli communities, butchering 1,300 Israeli civilians, mothers, babies, kids, their grandparents, their grandparents. Let us put things in the right sequence of order. The speeches and the rhetoric and the demagoguery of Mr. Barghouti and others is not something that has to replace reality, facts, and context.
But is he right in saying that Benjamin Netanyahu has every interest in prolonging the war?
Hamas, ISIS launched an attack on the state of Israel on October 7th, butchering babies while raping their
We agree.
We
agree. Everyone agrees on that panel on this. Is Benjamin Netanyahu, is it in his interest to prolong the war?
I'm not speaking for Mr. Netanyahu. I'm just telling us what in my opinion is the right thing. And Mr. Netanyahu is totally irrelevant in that context. If we want to have any kind of future of hope for Israelis and Palestinians, we must eradicate Hamas, ISIS, and Islamic Jihad. Because as long as they have the military power to continue and to dictate their agenda, their genocidal agenda, as long as they can dictate the Iranian interest, Palestinians and Israelis will continue to die in an endless circle of blood and destruction. If we want to have future of hope for Israelis and Palestinians, ISIS, Hamas, and Islamic Jihad military capacities has to be eliminated.
Right.
And basically, they have to be deprived of the ability to continue to dictate their genocide.
My question was about domestic Israeli politics. Iris Makler.
Here's what I want to say something, not exactly an answer to your question, but I want to throw a psychological observation into this ring. I think this is a watershed moment because Israel and Hamas have brought each other right now to face their worst fears. So what the Israelis fear is being butchered in their beds by violent marauders. That happened to them on October the 7th. What the Palestinians fear is a second dispossession, a second Nakba. They think that's what's happening to them right now in the Gaza Strip. And because everybody is facing their most primal fears, this is now such a bitter and violent conflict, like nothing I've ever seen in all the years I've been reporting here. I'm only repeating, of course, what everyone here has said. So I just want to throw that into the mix for why we're in this position. Will Benjamin Netanyahu continue this for his own self-interest? It's not impossible. He is someone who operates out of self-interest. He may be moved, you said there were 5 prime ministers in France during World War I. He may be moved if the prosecution of this war is not successful. He may be moved from within his own party. There is some talk about that. But I think the reason for the bitterness, that something snapped inside Israelis that I speak to on October the 7th when the details came out. And I can just see from anyone I speak to in Gaza, I'm in contact with that doctor in Gaza who's not prepared to move to the south. It's horrifying for Gazans. And he said to me, I will not move to the south because I will not repeat my grandfather's life. He was dispossessed from an area around Jerusalem. If I have to die here on my land, that's what I'm going to do. So everyone is living their worst fears. And Israel, I think, has a politician who, from what I read, from what I sense, and from what I see in the public reaction, may be, past his use-by date.
All right, maybe past his use-by date, and something that John Linden was saying a while ago about in this discussion about how suddenly the Middle East is on everybody's radar. The French president, who's traveling Tuesday to Israel and to an as-of-yet unnamed Arab state afterwards, we think. We don't know. We're guessing it's Egypt, maybe?
It would make most sense, considering it's on the Gaza border, yes.
In any case. The presidency here...
Qatar.
Or Qatar. The presidency putting out a statement saying Emmanuel Macron to discuss the creation of a Palestinian state during his Israeli visit, John Linden.
Yes, it's high time. And I want to kind of build off something that Ira said.
Can I please say something?
Just one moment, Mustafa, because we have been talking about a Palestinian state for a very long time. Benjamin Netanyahu, in his own words as well as deeds, has been doing everything he can to prevent the emergence of a Palestinian state. Palestinian division between Hamas and Fatah, the West Bank and Gaza, has also played its part in preventing the emergence of a Palestinian state. And international inaction, deprioritization and distraction have played their part in preventing a Palestinian state. Enough. This, and I applaud Mr. Macron if he's putting this towards the fore. We need to hear the same from President Biden. He was mentioning it in recent comments too. It needs to go beyond rhetoric. I think that we have. I don't want to repeat myself about kind of looking into the chasm, but as Ira said, both peoples are reliving the historical trauma that frames both Jewish identity and Palestinian identity. And if we allow those fears to continue to be manipulated by politicians and ideas in both Israeli and Palestinian society, it will continue to get worse. We will get worse ideas than Hamas, worse ideas than Benjamin Netanyahu, worse political programs appealing to people's fears. The international community, with the privilege of not living in the nightmare that Israelis and Palestinians have right now, have the responsibility to intervene and to present an alternative calculus. And just one more point on this, there is a historic opportunity within Israeli society. For a long time, it seemed fine to manage the conflict. It seemed like a burden to evacuate hundreds of thousands of settlers from the West Bank. It seemed fine to leave Gaza as an open-air prison in the way that it was. Nobody believes the status quo is sustainable. All of a sudden, the most core questions about this conflict are there for politicians to address and present solutions for. Now, some on the far right are going to present ideas which are abhorrent. And equally, there'll be Palestinian politicians, because I expect President Abbas to leave the political stage in some way soon. If Hamas is evicted from Gaza, as is the Israeli war aim, there will be suddenly a vacuum there. There's going to be more political space opening up in both societies simultaneously than we have seen since the Second Intifada. It is vital that that space is filled with good ideas based on self-determination, equality and peace. And one final point, this is going to play a role in our elections here too. We have elections in the European Union, in the United Kingdom and in the United States, all in the next 12 months. I believe we're going to see foreign policy play a greater role than in a very long time, and the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, we're seeing it playing out on our streets and our parliaments, will also play a role. So the responsible thing for international politicians to do is, rather than pit Israelis against Palestinians or, God forbid, Jews against Muslims, is to present a paradigm for conflict resolution. Run on that process, run on that idea, run on what you're going to do to rehabilitate Israeli and Palestinian societies and restore a diplomatic horizon for both peoples.
Mustafa Bardi, when Emmanuel Macron travels to Israel on Tuesday, he's doing so as the leader of the country that's home to the largest Jewish population in Europe and the largest Muslim population in Europe. What are you expecting from him?
First of all, I want to respond to something that was said. I was accused of having a short memory. I think the one who has short memory is the one who thinks that history started on the 7th of October this year. I think it's your guest who forgets about the fact that we're in this terrible situation since 75 years, since 1948. And we are in this terrible situation since Israel occupied the occupied territories 56 years ago. And we are in this terrible situation because that occupation transformed to be a demographic apartheid against Palestinian people, with the worst kind of racial discrimination which continues.
On Emmanuel Macron.
And I believe, regarding Macron, I think what we see today, and I totally agree with some of you, with one of your guests, is that it is the international responsibility which has shied away from taking its role in pushing for the two-state solution. Everybody speaks about two-state solution, and it became a cliche. Why? Because they don't want to force Israel to accept to end occupation. because they know that you cannot have a two-state solution while keeping 750,000 settlers in the occupied Palestinian territories in the West Bank. And because they know that the finance minister of Israel, Smotrich, who calls himself a fascist homophobe, keeps saying, and with Netanyahu's approval, that we will fill the West Bank with settlers and settlements so that Palestinians would lose any hope of a state of their own. And then we'll have one of three options, either to immigrate, which is ethnic cleansing, or accept a life of subjugation, which is apartheid.
So my question is, what are you expecting from Emmanuel Macron?
I expect him to say that he and the rest of the world has been guilty of not pushing for real peace in this region, and that they should have pushed for the implementation of the 1,000 UN resolutions that were ignored by the international community during all these years. And the big question here is if you want a two-state solution or just a continuation of this situation of occupation. You want two-state solution, I'll be clear. You have to say settlers have to be removed because the settlers are illegal according to international law. You don't want two-state solution, let's have one democratic state where we can live together in equality, without extremism, without people killing each other, with people looking and aspiring to a better future. I was so touched by an Israeli woman who lost her daughter on the 7th of October. And I was sad for her because I can feel the feeling of a parent who loses his son or daughter. But she said something very important. She said the response should not be vengeance. And what we see today is vengeance and revenge. Killing 2,020 Palestinian children will not solve the problem. What will solve the problem is to end the cause, the root cause. I am a medical doctor, as you know, and I know you can kill the patient if you concentrate only on the symptom. Look at the cause of the disease. The cause is oppression of one side of the other. The cause is occupation of one side of the other.
Getting the wheels of peace negotiations going, that's a big... that's a big get at this point when nerves are so raw, as our panelists have been saying. Right now, it's the question of whether or not there's going to first be a ceasefire, and the pressure is growing. EU leaders will be meeting at a summit on Thursday. They may be calling for a humanitarian ceasefire. There was a huddle of EU foreign ministers in Brussels this Monday. Some of them were pretty outspoken.
Ireland has called for a humanitarian ceasefire to allow goods, aid and supplies to the hospitals there in particular. This is a matter of the utmost urgency.
And once the violence is stopped, which is right now our main objective, both in Gaza and in Israel, and trying to prevent the spreading to the West Bank and Lebanon, we have to look forward. And the real solution is a Palestinian state recognized by the international community, living in peace and good neighborhood with a state of Israel.
Very briefly, because we're out of time, Avi Medel, is that pressure going to, or those words going to be heard in Israel?
Look, I just want to reiterate something that must be very simple. Hamas, ISIS does not want peace with Israel. He says that. He does everything possible to indicate that. So we have to be clear about it. As long as Hamas and ISIS and Islamic Jihad, radical Palestinian movement that are dictating death and destruction upon Israelis and Palestinians, as long as they are continuing to dictate their agenda, you can talk until the end of days about two-state solution. Hamas, ISIS, and Islamic Jihad are serving the Iranian regime. They are serving a radical agenda. Agenda of extremism, of butchering, of no peace, no future, just extremism and fundamental hate to the Jews, to the state of Israel, to their own brothers. For the sake of Israelis and Palestinians, we must eradicate Hamas, ISIS, and Islamic Jihad militant capabilities. So
we're out of time.
Palestinians will have some sort of a future, some sort of hope for a future. If we will continue exempting Hamas, ISIS from responsibility, if we will continue to do that, you can forget about two-state solution. It's about time to wake up. This is a pivotal moment for the world. It's about time to make it very clear. There can be no peace agreement as long as Hamas, ISIS, and Islamic Jihad are the one dictating the trajectory
Avi,
of Israelis and Palestinians. And I do share the
And Hamas is not ruling the West Bank. Why don't you make peace with Palestinians here?
All right, Avi Medel, that'll be the final word for now. It sounds like there'll be war before peace, but I want to thank you so much for joining us for this discussion. I want to thank Mustafa Bardi, John Linden, correspondent Iris Mockler in Jerusalem. Thank you for being with us here in the France 24 debate.